Welcome. This is Karen Summy, an independent demonstrator for Stampin' Up and owner of Karen's Blue Ridge Stamping, and I'm excited that you've dropped in today. Today I'll be featuring the Stampin' Up Blessings of Home bundle with the Blessings of Home Cling Stamp set and the Flowers of Home dies. These first appeared in Stampin' Up's January 2022 mini catalog and have been carried forward to the 2022-2023 annual catalog on page 75. I chose this set for today's project because I really love the large and small floral images that can be made in a multitude of colors. I personally love the coloring process, but you can make projects with this without coloring too. The large florals in the Blessings of Home set can be placed on a card in a number of ways and need little support from other products. It's just lovely all by itself. And it can be mixed and matched with all sorts of greetings to make different kinds of cards. The basic version of today's project can be done using only the Cling Stamp set itself, without the dies. I'll share a stepped-up version a little later that will use the dies as well. Don't worry about writing down any of these supplies for now. You can find a complete supplies list in the description below the video. One of the tools I always reach for when I start a new project is my Stampin' Up paper trimmer. It has two blades, a darker one for cutting and a lighter one for scoring. In this first project, I use Orchid Oasis cardstock for my base. Orchid Oasis is one of 5 new in colors this year for Stampin' Up. I'll be making a standard A2 card size. That takes 1/2 of an 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock, cut in half across the middle, leaving 2 8.5 inch wide by 5.5 inch tall pieces. But don't worry about the measurements now. You can find the link to my blog below the video, and all the measurements are provided for you there. First though, I score the cardstock down the middle at 4¼ inches for the fold using the lighter colored scoring blade. By scoring first, I got 2 card pieces that were already scored after I cut the cardstock in half. Scoring can be done after the cut, but scoring first can save a little time. I used the dark blade on the paper trimmer to cut the cardstock in half. Here's a quick tip for folding your cardstock after it's scored. Whenever you score your cardstock, you'll have a raised line on one side and a depressed line on the other side. Some crafters refer to this as a mountain and a valley. Always fold to the mountain whenever possible. It seems a bit counterintuitive, but folding to the mountain or the raised side keeps your cardstock from cracking over time. I use my bone folder once I fold the cardstock to give myself a really sharp crease on the card. Once my card base was ready, I decided to do my stamping next. I have a slight vision issue that keeps me from being a super straight stamper, and truthfully, I might have the same problem without the vision issue. Who knows? So if I do my stamping early on in the process, that keeps me from wasting time if I mess it up after I've invested time in other parts of the process. I mounted my stamps on 2 acrylic blocks and opened my Memento Tuxedo Black ink for the stamping. Now truthfully, I could have used Orchid Oasis for this part since that's the color of my card base. However, I tend to like a little bit more contrast on most of my designs, so I decided to go with the black in this instance. I started with the greeting on the front of the card as it was the most critical stamp to have straight. To leave room for the floral image to come, I stamped the greeting off-center and to the lower right side. While the black ink pad was open and ready, I decided to go ahead and stamp the inside greeting as well. After cleaning the first stamp, I switched out the greeting on the acrylic block and stamped my inside greeting in black, taking care to drop the greeting down about 1.5 inches from the top and in the middle from side to side. That distance isn't any kind of standard, it's just where I thought it looked good. That concluded everything I needed in black ink. Closing an ink pad is always a good idea when you no longer need it. Next, I opened my Orchid Oasis ink pad to stamp my floral images. As I mentioned earlier, the Blessings of Home images are great for coloring, or they can be used just as they are. In this case, I felt the beautiful design could stand on its own without the coloring. The dark saturated color on this stamp made it look particularly dark, but it came out just great. The nice thing about adding the flowers after the greeting is that I didn't have to work extra hard to get the image straight. I simply placed the flower to the left of the greeting and tilted the image to whatever degree I felt would look good, and it looked perfectly fine. Notice here that I did not re-ink my stamp after the first impression. I carried part of the floral image to the inside of the card, but I didn't want the inside impression to be as dark as the first one. By not re-inking the stamp, I got a lighter shade of the Orchid Oasis ink. The process of making two impressions with one inking is known as stamping off. Once the stamping was done, it was time to assemble the card. I used Tombow Mono Liquid Glue to put the pieces together. You'll often hear this referred to as green glue, not because the glue itself is green, but because the bottle is green on the ends. Now the glue doesn't actually come in a holder like this. I made this at home with a hard plastic cup and some hot glue. I simply like storing the glue this way so that gravity keeps it flowing downward. Even then, I sometimes need to get dried glue off the tip. There's no standard amount of glue to put on your paper, but you do want to be sparing near the edges of the paper so that it doesn't bleed out where you don't want it. I carefully centered the white cardstock onto the front of the Orchid Oasis card base, leaving about 1/8 inch on all four sides. I pressed it down to glue the pieces together. I then repeated this for the inside. One advantage of using glue rather than tape is that you have a few seconds where you can wiggle the paper around if you need to straighten it. Now you could stop here if you like. This is perfectly lovely as it is, but you could also add a few embellishments for a little extra pizzazz. Here I've used the Rhinestone Basic Jewels to add a little sparkle to the front. These embellishments already have adhesive on the back, so you simply pick them up off their clear plastic sheet and affix them to your card. Now here's a bit of a design tip for you. Whenever you place embellishments on your card, try to use an odd number for better visual appeal. Use 1, 3, or even 5 if you like. Also, try to visualize some type of triangle as you place your embellishments. This is also a good design technique. And here's our finished card. My second project also uses the Stampin' Up! Blessings of Home stamp set, as well as the new Decorative Circle Punch. Punches are a great way to add interest to a card and are fairly inexpensive tools for those who may choose not to invest in an embossing and die cutting machine. For this card, I made multiple stamp impressions and used heat embossing and coloring with alcohol markers. The techniques used for this card are slightly more advanced, but may be accessible to the beginner based on your personal artistic skills. And here's my process. Once again, I made a standard A2 size card, which is 5.5 by 4.25 when finished. This time, I used Flirty Flamingo for my card base, with some basic white as well. I continued to use the smaller floral image from the Blessings of Home stamp set, the combo pack of Stampin' Blends markers in light and dark Flirty Flamingo, the same as the card base, Versamark watermark ink, and my Stampin' Up! Heat tool. Using the Versamark ink pad, I started the design by stamping the floral image with Versamark ink directly to the card base. I used a piece of grid paper under my cardstock so that I wouldn't end up with ink on my work table. I stamped around the edges of the card base only, because the center was going to be hidden with another layer of white cardstock. It's difficult to see the stamping when it's first applied. The image will darken after I add my clear embossing powder and cure it out with my heat tool. For now, though, I wanted to be sure the Versamark ink stayed wet until I could add the embossing powder and cure it out with the heat tool. One step I generally take and neglected to do in this instance is to use my embossing buddy. The embossing buddy is a powder-filled bag that can be rubbed across the surface of the cardstock to reduce the amount of static before stamping with Versamark ink. This is an old Stampin' Up! Product which has just resurfaced in Stampin' Up's July through December mini catalog as part of the new Embossing Editions toolkit on page 49. Demonstrators and customers alike are thrilled to see this product return. Mine is probably 10 to 15 years old and is still going strong, so it's a great, robust product and a really good investment. The heat embossing process is one of the more magical qualities about making cards. It's always interesting to watch that embossing powder melt and have the image darken on the card base as you heat it with the heating tool. In addition to the clear embossing powder I used here, which simply darkens the image and exposes the card base color underneath it, Stampin' Up! Also has embossing powders in black, white, and metallics like gold, copper, and bronze. These are available in the annual catalog and can be found in the embossing section. They really make for some interesting looks. Once the embossing powder has been heat cured with the heat tool, it is completely dry to the touch. When you touch the surface, it has rather a rubbery feel to it, and it needs no additional wait time. You are free to follow the next step at that point and add anything on top of the card that you might wish. The tapping you see me doing on the surface of the card is because I did not use the embossing buddy in this case, and I wanted to make sure that there were no particles clinging to something that was not in fact stamped. Once I finished the background on the base, I laid it aside to work on the foreground in white. Once again, I repeatedly stamped the floral image on the cardstock, only this time I used Memento Tuxedo Black ink and started stamping in the top left quadrant. That allowed me to turn my stamp randomly and get as many images as possible on the paper without overlapping. The initial stamp was the one I chose as my focal point, and all of the others filled in around it. To keep a lighter stamped image throughout, I stamped off one time on scrap paper before stamping on the white cardstock. Next, it was time to start adding color with my Stampin' Up! Stampin' Blends markers. Because alcohol ink bleeds through the cardstock, I placed a piece of scrap paper underneath the paper to protect my work surface. The Stampin' Blend markers have two ends. The finer end has a thin line on the barrel to denote the pen tip and a thicker line at the other end to denote a brush tip. The markers have tight caps to prevent drying of the ink. Each marker also has its color name on the barrel. I started the coloring process with the dark Flirty Flamingo marker. There are many schools of thought about the best way to use the Stampin' Blends to achieve a good result. When I color a flower, I tend to start at the center of the petals with a dark shade and lighten it as I work my way toward the edge. I find this gives me a better three-dimensional look. While many will fuss with their colors to blend them out until there's no distinction between the light and dark shades, a quick peek at a tree outside in the sunshine will soon dispel the notion that nature is so well blended. True nature has many stark contrasts. I do some blending, but not extensive blending. I suppose what it all comes down to for my handmade cards is whether or not I really like my end result. Sometimes I'm looking for even more contrast than I can achieve with the darker shade of my marker. In that case, I may choose to underpaint with a shade of gray. In this case, I used dark gray granite to provide extra contrast. After coloring my card front, it was time to start assembling. I wanted to use a punch to shape my thank you greeting. Notice that I had my greeting crooked on the paper square. Punching out the sentiment gave me an opportunity to straighten out my greeting as well as give it a decorative shape. I used my own custom punch template ring to choose which of my punches to use. I made this tool myself, and you can find a link to this item below the video. After testing the fit of several punches, I finally decided to use the new decorative circle punch found in the 22-23 annual catalog on page 153. Because the paper square was so small, I couldn't hold it steady after placing the paper in the punch. So I grabbed a post-it flag with low-tack adhesive and placed it on the square as a temporary way to hold the paper. Once I positioned my square, I punched it out and simply removed the temporary handle. As I suspected, I wasn't happy with the white edge of the greeting meeting the white background beneath it. I wanted some separation, so I used a previously prepared piece of Flirty Flamingo cardstock cut to 3 3/4 inches by 1 inch. This small piece had heat embossed flowers created using the same process I used for the base of the card. After placing the greeting on the card again, I still didn't have the color separation I wanted. I decided to reduce the height of the small band from 1 inch to 3/4 of an inch. I finally decided to outline the punched greeting with a Stampin' Blends marker. Truthfully, this maneuver is a bit tricky, and I may have gotten a better result using a sponge to dab on a bit of ink around the edges. Still, I finally got the separation of color I was looking for. When I finally was happy with my punched and edged greeting, I placed Stampin' Dimensionals on the back of the circle and removed their adhesive backing with my Take Your Pick tool. This tool is a great way to capture all those little paper bits. I placed the greeting on the card and then glued the inside greeting on the inside back panel. Repeating the same process I had with card number 1, I placed 3 rhinestone basic jewels on the outside to complete my card. For my third card project, I repeated the same techniques I used for cards 1 and 2, only this time I also used the Flowers of Home dies and popped the floral images up from the surface of the card for added emphasis. Notice that the stem slightly overhangs the greeting banner. Once again, I used stamping only but did not color. I'm sure I will turn to this beautiful Blessings of Home bundle time and time again to make cards in a multitude of colors and with a variety of card types for birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, and all occasion cards. I hope you'll give them a try. If you liked the video, I hope you'll leave a comment on your favorite part and give me a thumbs up below the video. If you'd like to see more on my channel, be sure to click the subscribe button and also the notification bell to be notified when I upload new content. Until next time, happy stamping!